Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we really try to turn dense research into knowledge you can actually use.
And today, we're tackling a topic that's, well, it feels like it's right at the heart of almost every major social conflict right now.
Absolutely, we're talking about gender.
Yeah, it's not just a topic, is it? It feels more like the fault line, underneath so much of our politics, our culture.
Totally. I mean, you just glance at the news and gender, sexuality. They're unavoidable flashpoints.
Constantly.
Er,
Things like the ongoing fight for equal pay, that persistent pay gap, or think about online sexual harassment. It's fundamentally changed how a huge chunk of the population even uses the internet.
And it's not just social dynamics, it's hitting policy hard.
Ah,
Our sources point to, honestly, a dizzying number of laws, especially in the U.S., that are actively restricting any discussion around gender and sexual identity.
right. It impacts everything. School curriculums, those don't say gay bills are a
Yeah.
really stark example.
Yeah, and beyond schools, you see really severe restrictions on gender-affirming care debates and laws about who can use which public restroom, who gets to play on which sports team.
And it overwhelmingly impacts transgender and non-binary people. That's undeniable.
Exactly. And we can't just view this as a domestic U.S. issue, right? The global picture is critical here.
Oh, absolutely not. The conflict has ripples way beyond borders. I mean, when a country like Canada feels the need to issue a travel warning for its LGBTQIA plus citizens traveling to parts of the U.S., that tells you something significant.
It shows how local politics can have real, tangible global consequences for people's safety, their ability to just move around.
And the scale of outright criminalization is shocking. Human Rights Watch points out, I think the number is at least 67 countries have national laws that actually criminalize same-sex relationships between consenting adults.
67, that's staggering.
It really is. These are fundamental issues of power, identity, how society is structured, which is precisely why we need that sociological lens you mentioned.
So that's our mission for this deep dive, right? To give you that sociological toolkit. We want to move past just the headlines and ask why. Why are these flashpoints happening now?
Exactly. We're framing these conflicts as, well, as perfect subjects for sociological inquiry.
Yeah.
Our goal is to really explore how gender, sexuality, identity, expression, how they're all socially constructed.
And not just constructed, but imposed, enforced.
Reproduced, negotiated, all of it. If you want a shortcut to really understanding this incredibly complex system that governs these relationships, a way to analyze instead of just reacting,
Yeah.
this is it.
Okay. And before we jump into all the definitions, let's preview that central idea you mentioned earlier, the one that kind of helps simplify things. It's a bit provocative. Gender is real, but not true.
Yeah, I think that phrase really nails the sociological perspective.
Yeah.
It's concise, but there's a lot packed in there. Gender is real, absolutely real, because it has massive consequences.
Right. It shapes how people are treated, their economic standing, their safety, their status in society. It has undeniable, measurable effects on people's lives.
Totally. But, and this is the key part, it's not true.
Meaning it's not true in some kind of universal, biological, fixed for all time sense.
Precisely. It's not true because the meanings we attach to it are entirely specific to certain cultures. They change over time. They are definitely not biologically universal. How gender is lived and understood in downtown Chicago today is vastly different from 18th century Paris or a pre-colonial Samoan village.
Okay, so that's the core idea we're going to unpack. Let's get into how we actually arrive at that conclusion.
Right. Let's build that foundation. We need a systematic way to look at things. So before we can really dig into gender, we need to understand the structure it operates within.
Okay, so starting broad, what exactly is sociology? What does it study?
At its core, sociology is the scientific, systematic study of groups, societies, and social interactions. It uses, the scientific method observation, testing hypotheses, looking for patterns in behavior.
And it covers a huge range, right? From small groups up to massive institutions.
Absolutely. Everything from, say, the dynamics within a family or a group of friends, all the way up to giant social institutions like governments, economic systems, global networks. It's incredibly broad.
And those big institutions, they're built on these core concepts of society and culture. You can't really have one without the other.
They're totally intertwined. Society basically refers to a group of people living in a defined geographic area, interacting and sharing a common culture. Interaction is key.
And culture.
Culture is that shared stuff. The practices, values, beliefs, norms, social rules. It's like the blueprint for a group's way of life. Everything from daily routines to deep moral codes, family structures.
So sociologists study culture to see how interactions create shared meaning, how things stay stable.
Exactly, how we reproduce that shared understanding.
Okay, so now we have the macro framework, society, culture. Let's zero in on the terms specific to this deep dive, starting with the big one. Gender itself. How is it distinct from sex?
This is crucial. Gender refers to the meanings, the attitudes, behaviors, norms, roles that a society or culture assigns or ascribes to differences it perceives based on sex.
So it's about the social meaning, not just the biology.
Almost entirely.
Yeah.
When sociologists talk gender, we're talking social construction, performance, expectations. Sex, on the other hand, usually refers to the biological stuff, chromosomes, hormones, anatomy, though even that's more complex than people think. But for our purposes, gender is the social meaning layer.
Got it. And if we're talking social construction, we have to talk about the dominant system in many Western cultures and increasingly globally, the gender binary.
Yes, the binary. It's that very specific, very limited system where gender is classified as only masculine or feminine, full stop.
And these two categories are seen as opposites, mutually exclusive, and basically the only options available.
Right. And that's the real but not true system we mentioned. It shapes so much of our lives. But we have to stress this again. This binary classification is specific to certain cultures. It is absolutely not universal across all cultures, all history, or even biologically sound. It's a powerful social rule, not a scientific fact.
And when that rigid binary has social and economic consequences, it often operates under a specific power system.
Which our sources define as patriarchy. Literally, the word means rule of fathers.
Okay.
Sociologically, though, it describes a society where the characteristics, roles, behaviors we associate with masculinity carry more power, more status, more rewards than those associated with femininity.
So it's not just men rule, it's that masculinity is valued more. Can you give a concrete example?
Sure. Think about corporate leadership. You might have a woman who's great at collaborative communication, empathy, traditionally feminine traits, right? Often those are seen as soft skills, maybe not the fast track to the top. But if she shows traits traditionally seen as masculine assertiveness, tough negotiation, maybe emotional distance, she risks being labeled. Called bossy, abrasive, difficult.
The double bind.
Exactly. The system rewards masculine traits, but often punishes women for having them because they violate those gender expectations. That's patriarchy actively creating and reinforcing inequality.
Okay. And then there's heteronormativity. Related, but distinct.
Yeah, definitely related, supports patriarchy, but it's distinct. Heteronormativity is the social enforcement of heterosexuality as the default, the normal, even the required way to be.
How does it enforce that?
It's built on the idea that there are only two genders, they're opposites, and therefore romantic or sexual activity between people of the same gender is, well, deviant, unnatural, or just other.
Can you give an everyday example? Like, how does this invisible rule book show up?
Oh, it's everywhere in the background. Think about simple things like forms, wedding planning forms, doctor's intake forms, even just basic online profiles often default to male-female choices and assume you're looking for an opposite gender partner.
Right, you have to actively correct it.
Or just in conversation. If you mention your spouse or partner, what's the usual assumption? That they're the opposite gender, right? Having to constantly make that correction or assert a non-heterosexual identity. That little bit of friction reveals the pressure of heteronormativity. It's the invisible rule book subtly pushing a specific structure onto your life.
Okay. Before we get to the different ways of looking at this stuff, let's quickly pin down some essential identity terms. These are really at the heart of the conflicts and policies we mentioned at the start.
Definitely need clarity here.
Yeah.
So transgender. This term describes people whose gender identity is different from the gender they were assigned at birth. Usually that assignment is based just on observing external genitalia at birth.
And the counterpart
is cisgender. That describes people whose gender identity does align with the gender they were assigned at birth. Using these terms just acknowledges that alignment isn't universal.
Makes sense. And finally, the acronym that tries to capture the expanding spectrum, LGBTQIA plus Y.
Right. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and the plus. That plus is important.
Why the plus?
And the way the acronym itself has grown over time really acknowledges the incredible fluidity and diversity of gender identities and sexual orientations that exist beyond just gay or straight or the gender binary. It recognizes identity is dynamic, it evolves.
Okay, so defining terms is step one. But the real power, you're saying, comes in learning how to look at the world like a sociologist. You need a specific way of seeing, a lens, to even notice these long-lasting patterns and practices that enforce things like gender norms.
Exactly. Our sources lay out 4 really useful strategies for developing this perspective. It's all about making the familiar seem strange.
Making the familiar strange.
That's it. Well, if you only rely on what you already know, your own cultural background, you just see what you expect to see, which is usually just your own biases reflected back at you. We have to deliberately shift how we look.
Okay, let's start with lens one, the beginner's mind. This comes from Buddhist practice, right? But applied to sociology.
Yeah, people like Shunryu Suzuki talked about it, and sociologists like Mark McGrain brought it into the field. It's basically the strategy of approaching the world without your preconceived ideas, intentionally trying to unlearn what you think you know.
So you can be open to new information.
Exactly. Suzuki said something like, the expert sees only a few possibilities, but the beginner sees many. Because the beginner isn't constrained by existing frameworks. Even as experts, we have to practice this letting go of assumptions, especially with something as culturally loaded as gender. Start fresh.
That idea of unlearning seems really connected to lens too. Culture shock. Usually we think of that as feeling lost when traveling, but Peter Berger suggested applying it inwards.
That's the key insight. Examining your own culture, your everyday world, as if you were a radical outsider, making the familiar seem totally strange. You have to disrupt your own sense of normal.
How would that work for gender? Like, say, in the toy aisle.
Okay, perfect example. Walk into that aisle, the pink zone, the blue zone, and treat it like you're an anthropologist from another planet. Force yourself to describe something common, like a baby doll, as if you've never seen one.
Describe it without the loaded terms.
Right. Don't say baby or doll. What is it? Made of plastic, cloth, usually light. What's its function? It's a prop for practicing nurturing behaviors. Who gets to play with it? Traditionally, girls. How do they play? Feeding it, dressing it, soothing it.
Okay.
By breaking it down like that, materially and behaviorally, you stop just accepting it's a doll for girls. You start asking real research questions. Why this object for that group? What does playing with it teach them about future roles?
And connecting that specific object or action to the wider context. That sounds like the third lens, maybe the most famous one. The sociological imagination. C. Wright Mills.
Absolutely. The sociological imagination is that ability to see the connection between individual experiences, what Mills called private troubles, and the larger social forces and historical context, public issues.
So my personal stress isn't just my problem.
Right. It's about shifting focus. For example, feeling overwhelmed juggling work and childcare isn't just your personal failing. The sociological imagination connects it to the public issue, the systemic lack of affordable childcare, or the deeply unequal expectations around domestic labor. It links biography and history.
So back to the toy aisle again. How does the sociological imagination apply there?
We use it to question how socialization, the process of learning culture, shapes those individual toy choices. It helps us see that a kid picking a truck or a doll isn't just personal preference. It's deeply tied to broader social patterns, gender norms learned over time.
And why other kids might react negatively if those norms are broken.
Exactly. Why do even young kids sometimes police each other? Like when a boy wants to play with dolls. The sociological imagination tells us the answer isn't just individual prejudice. It's the external social structure, the learned cultural rules about gender, pushing back.
Okay. The final lens moves beyond just seeing connections to recognizing deep interconnectedness. Sociological mindfulness. Michael Schwalb.
Yeah, mindfulness pushes back against extreme individualism, that idea that you are solely responsible for everything that happens to you. It's a cultivated awareness of how interconnected the social world is, how your actions and the actions of others ripple outwards.
Like my choices affect people I don't even know.
In ways big and small, yes. Think of it as seeing the web. A single interaction isn't isolated. It reverberates through the lives of everyone involved and potentially beyond.
The source gives that really vivid example. The Nalakatuk, the blanket toss in some Alaskan Native communities. How does that illustrate interconnectedness?
It's perfect. The Nalakatuk ritual involves tossing someone high in the air using a large blanket made of, say, walrus skin, held by many people. The success of the jumper, their height, their safe landing, depends entirely on this huge, intricate social web.
It's not just the jumper's skill.
Not at all. You have to factor in everyone holding that trampoline, pulling those ropes in unison, the observers providing support, the people who hunted the walrus, prepared the skin, crafted the trampoline itself, the generations who passed down the knowledge and the ritual. If even one person lets go of their rope.
The whole thing fails. The jumper falls.
Precisely. It's a powerful metaphor for society.
So let's apply that mindfulness to something modern, like, say, a woman leaving a demanding job because of burnout. How does this lens change the analysis?
Instead of just saying, oh, she couldn't handle the pressure, sociological mindfulness forces us to look at the interconnected system. We have to ask, was she also shouldering most of the unpaid domestic labor at home?
Yeah.
Was the workplace culture maybe designed by and for men who didn't face that same second shift? Did the company rely on her unpaid emotional labor? Was she getting the same mentorship and sponsorship as male colleagues?
So the individual decision to quit is linked to this whole web?
Exactly. Her quitting is personal, yes. But the reasons are likely systemic, woven into that net of patriarchy, corporate structures, family expectations. We're all holding the ropes, whether we realize it or not.
That idea of figuring things in, seeing the web, leads perfectly into part 3. This understanding that the individual and the institution are, well, inseparable. Sociologists look for patterns, right? Recognizing that my private choices don't just happen in a vacuum.
That's Norbert Elias's concept of figuration. It's the process of analyzing individual behavior and the society shaping it simultaneously. You can't understand one without the other. Individuals must always be figured into the analysis of social institutions, and institutions must be seen as shaping individual actions.
So cultural patterns, social forces, they're always exerting pressure, even if we don't feel it directly.
Immense pressure, often invisible, pushing us towards certain choices over others.
And we can see this interplay really clearly when we look at how family structures have been changing, especially in the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. The so-called traditional U.S. family, heterosexual, married parents, kids, monogamous, that model has been the privileged standard for a long time.
Baked into laws, tax codes, cultural stories.
Right. But that standard is changing fast. Individual choices are adding up to create massive social pattern shifts.
And the data really backs this up, showing how diverse family life actually is now. The institutions seem to be lagging behind the reality.
They really are. You see huge increases in unmarried couples living together, same-gender couples raising families, blended families becoming common, more single-parent households, more single adult households.
And more extended families living together too, right?
Right.
Often out of economic necessity.
Definitely. And look at single parenthood. The data consistently shows around 80% of single parents are mothers. But then contrast that with couples. Nearly 15% of same-sex couples have kids, but only about 38% of heterosexual couples do. The patterns are complex and shifting.
And there's that trend of people choosing not to have children at all, which challenges that fundamental institutional link between coupling and reproduction.
Big time. That Pew survey from 2021 found 44% of non-parents aged 18-49 said they probably wouldn't have kids. That was up 7 points in just 3 years from 2018. The institution of family is diversifying much faster than our cultural scripts, or sometimes even our laws can keep up with.
And sociological research can really highlight the clash between those old gendered norms and people's actual lives, especially when traditional roles get flipped, like the research on breadwinner mothers.
Yes, Noelle Chesley's work is a great example. She did these deep qualitative interviews with heterosexual couples where the woman was the primary earner, earning like 80 to 100% of the household income.
And what did she find? Did financial parity solve the gender issues?
Not exactly. She found these women faced all the same financial pressures and work demands as traditional male breadwinners. But they also reported huge internal and external conflicts.
Conflicts like what?
Feeling like they were undermining their husband's masculinity. Feeling intense guilt about not living up to the cultural ideal of the good mother who prioritizes home and childcare above all else.
Wow. And the husbands.
The men, while obviously benefiting from the income, sometimes struggled with feelings of inadequacy or displacement. The study basically showed that even when you achieve economic parity at the individual level, those deeply embedded systems of gender and power, the cultural norms, they fight back. They manifest as personal stress, relationship tension.
So economic change doesn't automatically equal cultural change.
It's often much slower, much harder.
Okay, that idea that systems of power fight back brings us neatly to critical sociology. This is a branch that tackles power head on, even within research itself.
Yes, critical sociology is vital. It's dedicated to questioning how power structures influence everything about research,
Yeah.
what we study, how we study it, what theories we build. It focuses on identifying and analyzing systems of power.
Like sexism, racism, capitalism.
Exactly. These interconnected ideas and practices that link identity and social position to power,
Ugh.
and that work to make those power arrangements seem normal, natural, inevitable. Critical sociology asks how our own scientific work might be accidentally reinforcing or potentially challenging those inequalities.
And this is crucial because the history of social science itself, despite aiming for reason and objectivity, is kind of tangled up with these power systems, isn't it? It emerged from the European Enlightenment.
Right, the 17th, 18th centuries.
Yeah.
A time of incredible scientific progress, sure. But we have to remember the context. Who was doing the science? Overwhelmingly wealthy European men.
Universities, scientific societies, they explicitly excluded most women, people of color, non-Europeans.
And often the research itself was funded by profits from colonialism, slavery, resource extraction. That context matters profoundly.
Because it led to this huge systemic bias. These unacknowledged assumptions about human difference that produced ethnocentric theories. Theories that basically assumed white European men were the pinnacle, the norm.
And these weren't just abstract academic errors. They were used as tools. They provided justification for reinforcing power structures, for marginalizing non-European cultures, for continuing slavery and exploitation, for global colonization.
So the science itself helped legitimize inequality.
Tragically, yes. And the legacy of those biased, often explicitly racist and sexist theories still echoes today in global inequalities and marginalization.
There's that stark example from the sources about historical erasure. Harriet Martineau. Why is her story so important here?
Martineau was an absolute intellectual giant in the 1800s. She was fundamental in establishing sociology as a field. She translated and edited Auguste Comte's massive, dense work, making it accessible, essentially helping make him a founder.
But she did more than just translate, right?
Right. Oh, much more. She produced incredibly important original sociological work, analyzing women's conditions, the impacts of industrialization, arguing forcefully for gender equality, racial equality, the abolition of slavery. Groundbreaking stuff. But her original contributions were largely criticized, dismissed, or suppressed by the powerful men who dominated the field at the time. After her death, her legacy was effectively reduced to just being Comte's translator.
Erased.
Pretty much. Until feminist scholars much later in the 20th century deliberately went back and recovered and highlighted her original work. It's a classic example of how power systems can bury contributions that challenge the status quo, distorting even the history of knowledge itself.
Which makes the practice of reflexivity so incredibly important for researchers today. If the foundations were biased, how do we guard against that now?
Reflexivity is the key tool. It's that constant practice of self-reflection, asking, how might my own background, my biases, my feelings, my social position be influencing my research, my questions, my data collection, my interpretation?
It's not about achieving perfect objectivity, which is probably impossible.
Right. It's about making those biases, conscious and unconscious, visible, so you can acknowledge them, discuss their potential impact, and try to mitigate it. It's like an ongoing internal audit of your own perspective.
And that internal work is supplemented by external checks like peer review. But you also mentioned that how we do research matters using different methods like interpretive frameworks can challenge those old power dynamics.
Definitely. Interpretive frameworks often lean towards qualitative research, detailed observation, in-depth interviews, understanding subjective experiences, getting rich, nuanced stories, not just crunching numbers.
And involving the people being studied more directly.
Yes, through things like participatory research,
Yeah.
methods like photo voice, for instance, where research subjects become active partners. They help define the questions, collect the data, interpret the findings. It fundamentally shifts the power dynamic, letting people define their own experiences, which usually leads to better, less bias, more authentic understanding.
Okay, so we've got the tools, the historical context, the critique of power. Let's circle back to that core paradox. Gender is real, but not true.
Right, let's land on this again because it really holds everything together. It's real because it dramatically shapes lives. Pay, safety, power, all profoundly impacted by gender. Real consequences.
But not true because the meanings we attach, the roles, the norms, the expectations, they aren't fixed. They're socially constructed. They vary wildly across cultures and change over time.
Exactly. And the sociology of gender spends most of its time exploring those meanings and, crucially, the consequences, especially the injustices of gender inequality that arise from these constructions.
A huge part of that exploration involves pushing back against the gender binary, that rigid masculine-feminine box, because the fact that it's not universal is maybe the best proof that it is constructed.
It's incredibly powerful evidence. When you look globally, look historically, you find so many examples of non-binary systems, cultures with 3, 4, multiple genders, or that see gender as a spectrum.
The mere existence of these alternatives proves the binary isn't some biological mandate.
It's just one way of organizing things, a powerful social convention in some places, but not the only way for humanity.
Can you give us some of those specific cultural examples again? Because the social roles they played really highlight the difference.
Sure. Let's take two-spirit, a term used by some indigenous peoples across North America. It often described individuals embodying both masculine and feminine spirits or taking on social or ceremonial roles different from the gender assigned at birth.
And crucially, they weren't necessarily outcasts.
Often the opposite. In many of these cultures, two-spirit people were respected, even revered. They held important functional roles: healers, mediators, artists, caregivers. A stark contrast to the often harsh punishment for gender variance in colonizing European societies.
Okay, and the Samoan example, the Fathafafine.
Right. Fifafine translates roughly as "in the way of a woman." It describes people assigned male at birth who are recognized, often from a young age, as embodying both masculine and feminine traits. They traditionally play vital roles in the family, in community life, particularly around caregiving and the arts.
And again, accepted as part of the culture.
Integral to it, not seen as a deviation. These examples, and many others, clearly show societies can and do conceptualize gender in far more fluid, inclusive ways than a strict binary allows.
Yet globally, that binary combined with patriarchy still fuels massive entrenched inequality. Let's look at the data, remembering, as you said, that the very lack of data on trans and non-binary people in most global surveys is itself a form of inequality.
It absolutely is, erasure through statistics.
Yeah.
But even focusing on cisgender women versus men, the global picture is stark. That World Economic Forum report from 2020 looked at 190 countries, found women only have the same legal rights as men in 14 of them.
Only 14, wow.
And that legal inequality translates into brutal material reality.
Yeah.
Women make up something like 60% of the world's chronically hungry people, over 2/3 of those who are illiterate, and they own less than 20% of the world's land. It's systemic disadvantage on a global scale.
Bringing it to the U.S., the pay gap is probably the most talked about indicator, still hovering around 81 cents for women compared to a man's dollar, even controlling for many factors. Why does it persist?
Well, sociology points to a few interconnected things. There's the systemic devaluation of work fields traditionally dominated by women. Teaching, care work, administration are often paid less than male-dominated fields requiring similar skill levels.
Occupational segregation.
Right. And then there's the impact of caregiving, often called the motherhood penalty.
Oh, yes, the penalty. That feels like a really direct mechanism.
It is. Studies consistently show that mothers often face financial penalties based on assumptions about their commitment or availability after having children. They get offered lower starting salaries. One study found it was about 7.9% lower than non-mothers, which is 8.6% lower than men get offered.
While fathers sometimes get a bonus.
Sometimes, yes. Fatherhood can signal stability to employers, while motherhood signals potential distraction or divided loyalty in a patriarchal framework. It's deeply unfair.
And that 81 cents figure, it gets way worse when you bring race into the picture, showing how these power systems intersect and compound.
Absolutely critical point. Intersectionality is key. If we take white, non-Hispanic men's earnings as the baseline dollar in 2020, the data showed Latinas earned about 57 cents, Native American women 60 cents, Black women 64 cents.
That's drastically lower.
It is. And it powerfully demonstrates this isn't just about individual qualifications or effort. It's about deeply ingrained systemic biases in hiring, promotion, wage setting that value certain identities far more than others.
And the inequality isn't just about paid work. There's the whole issue of unpaid labor, the second shift.
Or the unpaid double duty, yeah. This is huge. Women, regardless of their employment status, still perform the vast majority of household management and domestic work.
What kind of numbers are we talking?
One set of data showed 86% of women spend significant time on household management, scheduling, shopping, cleaning, organizing, compared to only 71% of men. That unpaid work takes time, energy, mental load.
Which impacts their paid work, their leisure, everything.
Exactly. It maintains a structural disadvantage, limiting career advancement, contributing to burnout, even when women are succeeding in the paid workforce.
So the sociology of gender, much like critical theory, looks at all this inequality and says this is dysfunctional. But why dysfunctional?
Because it proves the inequality isn't natural. It's not based on inherent biological differences in ability. If it were biological, you'd expect it to be consistent across cultures and time, right?
But it's not.
It's clearly not. Therefore, these persistent uneven gaps in power, wealth, health, rights, they must be socially created. They're manufactured and made to seem normal by systems like patriarchy, interacting with racism, capitalism, and others. It's an inefficient, unjust, constructed system of control.
Okay, so if this massive inequality is socially constructed, how did sociology get from just noticing it to developing theories we can use to actually challenge it? The field itself has changed quite a bit, hasn't it?
Oh, massively. Especially over the last, say, 50 or 60 years. The early work, back in the 1960s and 70s, often fell under the banner of sociology of women, or women's studies.
Focused mainly on cisgender women's experiences.
Primarily, yes. The goal was to make women's lives and perspectives visible, because they'd been largely ignored. Think of foundational texts like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in '63, talking about the unhappiness of suburban housewives, or Anne Oakley's research in the late '60s on housework, taking it seriously as labor. They really focused on women's roles, particularly in the domestic sphere, and established that idea of the gender role.
But then the theory took a big leap in the late 80s, right? Moving from just having a passive role to actively performing gender.
That was the game changer. Candace West and Don Zimmerman's 1987 article, Doing Gender. It's iconic. They argue gender isn't something static that we are, it's something we actively do every single day.
How we walk, talk, dress.
Everything. We're constantly performing our gender, and our social competence, our acceptance, is tied to how well we perform it according to societal expectations.
And society polices those performances.
Constantly. Think about those everyday corrections. A man shows vulnerability, gets told to man up. Or that classic insult, don't be such a girl. That policing reinforces the idea. You must constantly, actively do your assigned gender correctly, or risk falling into a lower status category.
Which then paved the way for Judith Butler's work just a year later, pushing that performance idea even further.
Butler took that idea and ran with it. If gender is made through performance, through these repetitive everyday acts, well, then it's also possible to unmake it or remake it by performing it differently.
But doing gender in non-normative ways.
Exactly. This was huge for opening up the theoretical space to understand transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming experiences not just as deviations, but as active interventions in the gender system. And following that, in the 80s and 90s, the field broadened significantly. Scholars like R.W. Connell and Michael Kimmel started looking critically at masculinity itself as a social construction, not just focusing on femininity.
So the field evolved to look at all genders.
Right. It became the sociology of gender, not just women.
Okay, this evolution brings us to the payoff question for you, the listener. Why does studying all this matter? What's the practical value of having this sociological understanding of gender?
I think the core value is really about intervention and finding solutions. When you understand the systemic nature of inequality, you can move beyond just blaming individuals or moralizing. You can start identifying the mechanisms that create problems like sexual violence or unequal health outcomes or the pay gap, and then you can target those mechanisms for change.
It also helps us see those invisible structures at play in everyday life, right? How individuals fit or don't fit.
Definitely. You start noticing things like how gender norms subtly channel people. Why are elementary schools overwhelmingly staffed by women, while university presidents or even school superintendents are disproportionately men? It's not random choice. It's social channeling based on deeply ingrained ideas about who is suited for what type of work or leadership.
And maybe most crucially, this kind of social research provides validation. It backs up people's lived experiences.
This is so important. When researchers collect solid data showing, say, a consistent pattern of discriminatory hiring against mothers, or the stark reality of the racialized wage gap, that research validates the feeling of unfairness that individuals might experience.
It shifts the blame.
Exactly. It moves the focus from, maybe I didn't try hard enough, or maybe I'm just not cut out for this, to recognizing, no, the system is discriminatory. That validation is incredibly powerful.
And that collective validation, based on data, gives social movements the ammunition they need.
Precisely. It provides the common ground, the evidence of shared interest despite different individual experiences, that organizers need to build coalitions. Think about movements like Black Trans Lives Matter. They use data on violence and discrimination to demand systemic change, targeting policies and institutions, not just individual attitudes.
It connects that person feeling burned out back to the whole web, the whole nalakottic blanket, showing it's the structure, not just the individual, that needs fixing.
Beautifully put, yes. Hashtag tag outro.
So we started this deep dive looking at all the social fiction, the headlines, the conflicts swirling around gender and identity. Our goal was to use sociology's tools to understand gender not as fixed, but as this profound, powerful, yet ultimately flexible social construct.
And hopefully you've gained some of those tools now. We talk about using a beginner's mind, harnessing the sociological imagination to link the personal and the historical, and practicing reflexivity to see how power systems like patriarchy, like heteronormativity operate, often invisibly, sometimes built on biased foundations.
We landed back on that core idea. Gender is real in its consequences, absolutely. But it's not universally true because its meaning is constantly being negotiated, culturally specific. Just look at examples like two-spirit traditions or the Fufafine.
Right. So here's a final thought for you to chew on, something that connects directly back to those stark patterns of inequality we discussed. We know the traditional family is changing. We know stay-at-home dads exist. We know breadwinner moms exist. And the census data tells us about 20% of single parents in the U.S. are fathers.
Which means, flip side, a full 80% are mothers. The financial weight, the logistical burden, the sheer work of single parenthood falls overwhelmingly on women across race and class lines.
So here's the sociological question. If we accept that gender inequality is not biological, if men are just as capable of nurturing, of managing a household, then what? What specific societal mechanisms, what systems of power, what policy gaps are responsible for maintaining this incredibly skewed 80-20 split?
What stops men from taking on single parenthood more proportionally? Or what pushes women into it?
Exactly. What further research, using these sociological lenses we've explored today, do we need to really understand and maybe even start to interrupt that specific persistent pattern of inequality? How do we share that load more equitably?
Something important to think about as you look at the world around you, now hopefully with a bit more sociological imagination. Thanks for diving deep with us.
See you next time.